the golden age of comics, from when Superman lifted up that car up until when Barry Allen sped across the pages of Showcase issue 4. This is where the foundations of the Superman mythos were built, but you rarely hear people talk about the details of it. That's why I'm here to guide you through the nitty-gritty of Golden Age Superman stories. At the tip of the iceberg, we have the Superman-related information everyone knows about. The average people you will find, young and old, know at least most of these things. Where better to start than with the man himself, Superman, alias Clark Kent. Just about all the stuff everyone knows about Superman gets established very early on, much of it in Superman's very first appearance in Action Comics issue 1. The man from another world who fights crime with superhuman abilities, posing as mild-mannered reporter Clark Kent. You might have feared that he originally couldn't fly, but could only jump very high. Possibly inspired by John Carter from Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom novels. It wouldn't take long for this to develop into the writers giving Superman the power to fly, and a whole other arsenal of superpowers as Superman kept getting developed as a character. Lois Lane, also first appearing in Action Comics issue 1. Again, much of what we think about when we hear Lois Lane was there from the beginning. The feisty, news-hungry reporter who will stop at nothing to get a story and has the hots for Superman. A recurring element in the Golden Age Superman stories is Lois suspecting Clark Kent's real identity but always being outwitted. Lois and Superman finally kiss for the first time in Superman issue 75. Ma and Pa Kent, the couple who raised Superman since he was a baby. While they don't make many appearances in the Golden Age, they're pretty much the Kents you know and love. The big difference is that in this continuity, their names are Mary and John, while in just about every other continuity after the Golden Age, their names are Martha and Jonathan. Lex Luthor, Superman's archenemy. Making his first appearance in Action Comics issue 23 in 1940, his first name was unknown until some point in the 50s, just going by Luthor in the Golden Age. He also had a head of hair in his first few appearances. The artist started drawing him bald after that because at one point an artist mistook him for another bald criminal scientist called Ultra Humanite. Who's Ultra Humanite? We'll get to him later. Like many Golden Age characters, Luthor doesn't have much depth. He's pretty much a generic scientific genius criminal. Kryptonite, the green material from Krypton and Superman's most well-known weakness. In later continuities, there's a whole encyclopedia of variations of Kryptonite, but in the Golden Age, there's only one, the classic green Kryptonite, which does exactly what Kryptonite has always done: weaken Superman and serve as a hazard to his life through exposure to him. Action Comics, the comic Superman got his start in its very first issue in 1938. I have the DC Archives reprint right here. I also have the Millennium reprint somewhere, but I can't find it. Throughout the Golden Age, Action Comics always started off with one Superman story at the start and stories from several other characters nobody cares about anymore, like Congo Bill and Hayford Henry. Superman Volume 1, the comic which started in 1939, dedicated to just printing Superman stories. It was standard for comic book characters when they got popular enough at this time to get their own comic published simultaneously with a comic where they star in all the stories, like Detective Comics and Batman, Flash Comics and All Flash, All American Comics and Green Lantern, and Sensation Comics and Wonder Woman. As we dip down the iceberg, now's the stuff that's not really common knowledge, but most comic fans know about. Superboy, the younger incarnation of Superman, mostly when he was in his teens, but sometimes when he was younger. Stories about Superboy are still made by DC Comics today, but they've been making stories about Superman when he was a boy since 1945. Perry White, the editor of the Daily Planet. With his catchphrase, "Great Caesar's Ghost," this man has been a foundational supporting character ever since 1940. Perry White regularly sets up stories and gets the plot going by sending Lois and Clark out on assignments, and occasionally gets involved on the adventures himself. Jimmy Olsen, cub reporter and friend to Superman and Lois. In the 40s, Jimmy Olsen was only a semi-recurring tertiary character, seen in the newspaper offices with Lois and Clark and not getting too involved with the plot. Early on, there's an unnamed office boy who some identify as the earliest incarnation of Jimmy Olsen, starting with blonde hair and later being drawn with ginger hair and green clothes associated with Jimmy. This boy also looked like he could be in his early teens or pre-teens, which makes me question Metropolis's child labor laws. Eventually, Jimmy was established as a young adult, and by the mid-1950s, Jimmy became a regular character in the comics and one of Superman's closest friends. Mr. Mxyzptlk, the impish troublemaker from the Fifth Dimension. This interdimensional trickster made his first appearance in Superman issue 30 in 1944. Mr. Mxyzptlk's modus operandi is to use his reality-bending powers to mess with Superman for amusement. In 2000s or early 2010s terms, he did it for the lulz. Mr. Mxyzptlk could be sent back to his own dimension and be prevented from returning for 90 days if he says his name backwards. so Superman would always have to rack his brain around tricking the diminutive fiend into doing just that. Mr. Mxyzptlk's stories are usually some of the more imaginative ones from this era, since the writers could go wild and think up all sorts of things for Mr. Mxyzptlk to conjure and distort reality. His original design was that of a purple-suited bald man in a comically small bowler hat. Throughout the 40s and 50s, they kept tweaking with his design, changing the colour of his suit, the colour and size of his bow tie, and the shape of his head. Until near the end of the Golden Age, he went through this futuristic phase that looks like a green version of his clothes used from the Silver Age onwards. Jor-El and Lara, Superman's biological parents, who, aware of Krypton's impending doom, sent away their infant son in a rocket. Jor-El and Lara aren't really fleshed out early on, so they're mostly just seen in brief flashbacks to Krypton before it was destroyed. Jor-El looks a lot like Superman and wears a similar suit to him. Lana Lang, originally introduced as a schoolmate of Clark Kent's when he was a teenager in Smallville in Superboy issue 10, in 1950. Lana had a similar role to Lois in that she had feelings for both Clark and his super persona, and would try to uncover his secret identity that she was suspicious of. While she was later reintroduced as an adult in the Silver Age, the Golden Age only featured her in stories where she was a teen in Smallville. Adventures of Superman. This was the first television show about the Man of Steel and was a huge step forward towards growing Superman's audience. It aired for most of the 1950s with over 100 episodes, and had an effect on the comics since Jimmy Olsen got featured in the comics drastically more once the television series aired. A few of the episodes are direct adaptations of stories from the comics. Jimmy Olsen says Jeepers a lot, and the only recurring characters from the comics they use are Superman, Lois, Perry White, and Jimmy Olsen. I was disappointed they didn't use anyone from Superman's Rogues Gallery, not even once. I didn't expect there to be a Mr. Mxyzptlk episode because I doubt they'd have the budget for that, but they could have written Lex Luthor into some of the episodes easily instead of generic criminal scientists. World's Finest Comics. In 1941, World's Best Comics hit the shelves and rebranded to World's Finest Comics in the very next issue. At first, issues of World's Finest Comics would start with a Superman story at the front, a Batman story at the end, and the rest in between would be stories featuring lesser known characters, much like what Action Comics and Detective Comics did. This changed in 1954 with World's Finest Comics issue 71, where instead it was changed to one story at the beginning with both Superman and Batman working together. A lot of the early covers of World's Finest Comics are just Superman and Batman tormenting Robin. It wouldn't be until a decade or so later that Superman would turn his pent-up frustrations on Jimmy and Lois. Adventure Comics. When DC started regularly printing Superboy stories, they published Adventure Comics, which served as Superboy's equivalent of Action Comics, that being one Superboy comic in the front, and more obscure titles for the rest of the comic. These comics fleshed out what Clark Kent's life was growing up in Smallville, attending school, and interacting with his adopted parents, Lana Lang, and society as a whole. Superboy Volume 1, the exact parallel to Superman Volume 1, several stories all starring Superboy. Just like the Adventure Comics, the stories would feature the adventures of Superboy. At least during the Golden Age, Superboy stories would mostly be grounded, and while sometimes he would go to space or travel through time, a lot of them were stories about helping people who were down on their luck and dealing with generic gangsters at the same time. The Fortress of Solitude, Superman's residence when he's not in Metropolis. It's been a staple of Superman for nearly his entire history. The Fortress of Solitude is where Superman stores keepsakes from past endeavours, conducts experiments, and spends some of his recreational time. It was first in an undisclosed location in the mountains when it first appeared in Superman issue 17 in 1942, but eventually it was moved to the polar ice caps. We've moved down to the Iceberg section, where if you know any of this, you must know more about Superman or comics than 99% of people. The cartoons made by Fleischer and Famous Studios. Superman's first on-screen appearance, and boy howdy did they make it count with this one. The story behind how these were made is that when approached to make these cartoons, Dave Fleischer didn't want to make them, so he asked for a sky-high budget and was surprised when Paramount actually delivered on it. And just look at the results. It's fascinating to see a Superman adaptation this early in Superman's history. While it does a lot well, some of the episodes have a jarringly dark tone, especially when you compare it to a lot of Golden Age comics, which are generally lighthearted. Sometimes the music, sound design, and lighting make what would be normal in pulp narratives seem downright menacing, whether it's robots, a gorilla, ancient Egyptians, Hitler, or bird people. If you only watch one thing that's on this iceberg, I'd recommend these beauties. While the Adventures of Superman TV series is somewhat known, the film that preceded it, Superman and the Mole Men, remains more obscure. It was released in cinemas before the TV show was made, and it has some of the same cast and creative minds behind it. It's about Superman rescuing some subterranean dwelling dwarf people from townsfolk trying to hunt them down. Superman the Mole Men just feels like a feature-length episode of the series it later spawned, so I'd only recommend it for die-hard Superman fans. All-Star Comics and Superman's Justice Society of America membership. Before there was the Justice League of America, there was the Justice Society of America, which was featured in All-Star Comics. The Justice Society of America was DC's main team of superheroes during the Golden Age, which included The Flash, the Green Lantern, Wonder Woman, the Atom, Dr. Midnight, Hawkman, and Johnny Thunder. And what about Superman and Batman? I hear you shriek like a bitch. Well, All-Star Comics was there for DC's Tier 2 heroes, so Superman and Batman would only appear in this series once in a blue moon. However, Superman and Batman were made honorary members in All-Star Comics issue 7. More fun comics. Before moving to Adventure Comics and getting his own comic dedicated to himself, Superboy's first appearance was in More Fun Comics issue 101 in 1945. Superboy would continue to appear in several issues of More Fun Comics which would have one Superboy story in them, with the rest of the comic featuring other characters, pretty much exactly like Adventure Comics did. Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen. This was the spin-off series of comics where Jimmy Olsen took the spotlight while Superman was more of a supporting character. Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen is most commonly associated with the Silver Age, where the bulk of the series was printed, but it started at the tail end of the Golden Age in 1954. This series was probably started because of Jimmy's rise in popularity caused by the Adventures of Superman TV show. Ultra-Humanite, Superman's first recurring enemy. Referring to himself as the Ultra-Humanite because of his super intelligence, he's the wheelchair-bound megalomaniac scientist with ambitions for world domination. He's so similar to Lex Luthor that that's probably the reason why the artist started drawing Lex Luthor as bald, because they confused the two and it just stuck. Ultra-Humanite first appeared in Action Comics issue 13 in 1939, but he pretty much disappeared for the rest of the Golden Age. Or you could say she disappeared because... Dolores Winters, assistant to Ultra-Humanite. After his apparent death in Action Comics issue 19, his brain was transplanted into the body of his assistant Dolores Winters, which meant Ultra-Humanite could technically return to continue his quest for world domination in Action Comics issue 20 and 21, the Prankster. A regular foe of Superman throughout the 1940s, who first appears in Action Comics issue 51 in 1942. He plagues Metropolis with prank-themed crimes and sees an artistry in pulling off prank-themed heists, even being a good sport when Superman can outwit him with a prank of his own. Throughout the Golden Age, he was the second most recurring villain Superman faced. The Toyman, a criminal mastermind who uses toys he designed to carry out the robberies he plans out. He first appeared in Action Comics issue 64 in 1943. He looks like Benjamin Franklin's backwards brother and appears less than a dozen times throughout the Golden Age. Lois and Sarah Lang, Lana Lang's parents. Professor Lois Lang is an explorer whose job takes him and his wife around the world, leaving Lana behind to snoop about, looking to unveil Superboy's secret identity. Both made their first appearance alongside their daughter in Superboy issue 10. The Daily Star. It's common knowledge among Superman fans that Clark, Lois, Perry, and Jimmy work at the Daily Planet newspaper. But it was originally called the Daily Star until it was renamed to the Daily Planet in 1940. Why? We'll get to that soon. Now we're submerging into deep lore. If you bring up any of this in casual conversation, people are going to assume you care about Superman at least a bit too much. The radio show. The Adventures of Superman radio program ran from 1940 to 1951 and had over 2,000 episodes. While it's mostly forgotten today because who still cares about radio shows from the mid-20th century, or for most people radio shows in general, the radio series has the distinction of being the first non-print adaptation of Superman. Not only that, but a few hallmarks of the Superman franchise originate from the radio show, including Jimmy Olsen, at least as a name character, Perry White, Kryptonite, and the iconic phrase,
"Up in the sky, look, it's a bird,
It's a plane!
it's Superman!"
the newspaper strip. From 1939 all the way up until 1966, there was a Superman newspaper comic strip, which published original stories separate from the comic books. It's mostly forgotten now, but it can be credited not with the first appearances, but the first to name the city of Metropolis, the planet Krypton, and Superman's biological parents. And the newspaper was called the Daily Planet in the newspaper strips, which is why it was eventually changed to that in the comic books. It also introduced Sergeant Casey, who was a recurring police officer character during the Superman comics throughout the first half of the 1940s. He would usually assume that Superman and Lois had illegal ambitions and that Superman was a super crook. It's a sign of how early these were in Superman history that there are cops skeptical of Superman, and it's odd seeing him dodge bullets being fired by a police officer. Speaking of characters who didn't last past World War II, George Taylor, the first editor of the Daily Star/Daily Planet before Perry White was in the picture. Going back to the newspaper comic, while first appearing in Action Comics issue 1, the newspaper strip comic is where he was first named. However, he disappeared after the first few years and was replaced by Perry White as the Daily Planet's editor. Lois Lane Girl Reporter was a short-lived spin-off of the newspaper Superman comic strips. As you can tell by the title, it was a comic of Lois-centric stories, predating Lois getting her own comic book, Superman's Girlfriend Lois Lane, by 15 years. Though the main Superman comics would sporadically have one story dedicated to Lois's endeavors from time to time. Anyway, the Lois Lane Girl Reporter comic strip lasted only a few months with a dozen strips, which isn't surprising. Come on now, a dame reporter? The Superman film serial from 1948. This is so old it came out when film serials were shown in cinemas. It was the very first live-action adaptation of Superman. While it came out years before Superman the Mole Men and the Adventures of Superman TV series, it feels very similar to them. It even has the same actress play Lois. One cool thing it does is incorporate 2D animation for scenes where Superman has to fly, and the main antagonist is called the Spider Lady, and is also based on a character from the newspaper comics. 2 years later, the follow-up, Atom Man vs Superman, came out. If you like the first Superman serial, you'll get more of the same from this one in terms of overall quality. Like the first serial, it suffers from slow, plodding pacing as they had to stretch the plot to 15 chapters. But as long as your standards aren't too high, it's worth giving it a chance if you're curious or a super fan of the Superman. Stamp Day for Superman, a short film made with most of the main cast of Adventures of Superman reprising their roles to star in what's pretty much a public information film informing and encouraging people to buy US saving bonds. It's almost as long as a normal episode, and it's worth watching if you like cheesy 50s media or old informational films. The Adventures of Superman novel. Way back in 1942, the very first prose novel of a comic book character was published, with The Adventures of Superman. Having a World War II setting, the story is about Superman investigating a rumor of a ghost ship that turns out to be Nazi spies. I have a physical copy from 1979 that calls itself a historical reproduction. Yeah, that's a fancy way of saying you're bootlegging an old book to cash in on the Superman film that came out a year earlier. New York World's Fair Comics. Before there was World's Finest Comics, there was New York World's Fair Comics. It was exactly the same as the first 70 issues of World's Finest Comics, in that it was a Superman story at the front, a Batman story at the back, and lesser known comic stories in between. There were only 2 issues, one in 1939, a second in 1940. They were the first comics to feature both Superman and Batman in them, although neither would appear alongside each other in the same story until All-Star Comics issue 7. Superman's Christmas Adventure. I read this in DC Universe Christmas, a collection of Christmas-related DC comics. I haven't even read anything else in this, I only got it to read Superman's Christmas Adventure. This is a one-shot comic from 1940 that was given away at department stores and a bakery as well. It's pretty standard for a cheesy Christmas special, where Superman teaches an ungrateful rich kid to be more thankful for his gifts, Lois and Clark help Santa deliver presents, and they foil a pair of Christmas haters called Dr. Grouch and Mr. Meanie, who are trying to ruin Christmas. There's also a boy called Billy Connolly in it.
They've got light-seeking, heat-seeking, sound-seeking equipment, laser beams, x-rays, fucking searchlights, secret fucking pads underfloor. They've got everything except a fucking ghost! Because there's no such fucking thing!
Terry Curtis, who was a nuclear scientist from an Ultra-Humanite story from Action Comics issue 21. He only appeared in one story during the Golden Age, but that's not why he's on this iceberg. Decades later, Terry Curtis was brought back and reinvented as a short-lived superhero called Cyclotron, but he didn't really last as a character past that. The Puzzler, the criminal scientist who appeared 3 times during the Golden Age, first in 1942 in Action Comics issue 49, and 2 single-panel appearances in Superman issues 20 and 21. The Puzzler would match Superman's physical powers with his wits by doing things like concocting mind games for Superman to overcome, and challenging him to checkers. I mean, the man proclaimed himself to be the world's most brilliant checkers player. Hey! What'll he do if DC ever brings him back? Play Supes at a game at Jack's? Struggle to your best ability, Superman, but I got 3Zs. J. Wilbur Wolfenham. Making his first appearance in Superman issue 26 in 1944, J. Wilbur Wolfenham was a sleazy con man who would sporadically show up throughout the Golden Age to scam people out of as much money as he could get his grubby mitts on, much to the anguish of Superman. No matter what though, he would always get his comeuppance by the end. J. Wilbur Wolfenham was one of the more recurring Superman villains of his time, with his stories being light-hearted by comparison to Lex Luthor, for example, because while Lex Luthor would be out for things like world domination and wasn't above killing anyone who stood in his way, Wolfengan was a comedic antagonist whose villainy extended to scamming people out of their money. Mars Boy, the alter ego of Sutri, who was a teenage boy from Mars who had similar powers to Superboy, only his superpowers came from an exposure to an asteroid rather than being born with them. When he first came to Earth in 1951 in Superboy issue 14, he briefly clashed with Superboy but quickly adjusted to Superboy's lifestyle with a secret identity and catching unwanted attention from Lana Lang. Superboy and Mars Boy would team up to help with each other's problems, and while Mars Boy was only in 3 issues, this foreshadowed how Superboy would go on to ally himself with other costumed youths, like the Legion of Superheroes in the Silver Age. Mark Olsen, Jimmy Olsen's father. This just about made it on the Iceberg because Mark Olsen only makes one appearance in the Golden Age, close to its end in Adventure Comics issue 216 in 1955, which reveals that Jimmy Olsen's dad is a professor who worked at Smallville's Natural History Museum. What's more interesting about this comic is that it includes Clark Kent and Jimmy Olsen meeting when they were young. On one hand, it's sweet how when Clark Kent was a teenager he met one of his closest friends when he was a little boy, but it feels like too much of a coincidence how both of the main players who would go on to work at the Daily Planet both came from the same town. Humpty Dumpty, legal name Robert Hobb. This was a costume crook who wore a silly outfit and called himself Humpty Dumpty because he's bald and fat. His debut was in Superboy issue 6 in 1950 and he would make 4 more appearances in Superboy that year. The Golden Age had some lame characters. Metallo, specifically the Metallo named George Grant, yet another criminal scientist who menaced Superman. Really most of Superman's recurring enemies at this time were some form of scientists, but a couple of things set Metallo apart from the rest. Most strikingly is his mechanical suit, which makes him a physical match for Superman because of the metal alloy the suit is made out of being the strongest metal on Earth, along with the strength serum invented by Metallo. Not only that, but this Metallo only matched wits with Superman once during the Golden Age, but he was the first character to bear the name Metallo, even though this version is spelled with one L. There wouldn't be another Metallo until the late 1950s, but this character was completely different other than the name. The name Metallo is similar to Clayface from Batman, and that the original character with that name is from the Golden Age and has nothing to do with the later characters called Metallo and Clayface who got much more popular. The Flying Newsroom and Jumbo Jones. In the first issue of Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, we are introduced to the Daily Planet's company helicopter, which they call the Flying Newsroom, which Jimmy and Lois use when they need to get somewhere that requires flight. For the first 5 issues, it was flown by a pilot named Jumbo Jones, but after issue 5 he disappeared and the Daily Planet reporters would just fly it by themselves. Really, Jumbo was an unnecessary character.
Jumbo, go away.
Now for the details of this era of Superman that lay sunken down at the bottom of the iceberg. Even most people who have dedicated themselves to memorizing Superman trivia won't recognize these. How Superman would end the war. In 1940, as World War II raged in Europe, Superman's creators, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, made a 2-page comic for Look magazine, where Superman personally arrests Hitler and Stalin and takes them to face justice at the hands of the League of Nations in Geneva. The funny thing about this is that Jerry Siegel was Jewish, yet his name sounds similar to the Nazis' well-known catchphrase, Superman's Christmas Adventure, not to be confused with the previous festive tale, but a different comic also called Superman's Christmas Adventure that was published in 1944. This one has Lois and Clark meeting dwarves on an island in the Pacific who help them get off the island. Then they fight off a Japanese ship and help Santa deliver his toys. This one hasn't even had the honor of being reprinted like the first Superman's Christmas Adventure. Susie and Lucille Tompkins. Susie Tompkins is Lois Lane's niece who made a few appearances in the comics, starting in Action Comics issue 59 in 1943. She was a regular Baron Munchausen with her overactive imagination and tendency to distort the truth, driving Lois and Superman up the wall. Lois' sister Lucille makes an appearance in Action Comics issue 98, which marks her first and only appearance in the Golden Age. But it's at least noteworthy that this is the first, and for a long time only time, Lois' sister makes an appearance. Hocus and Pocus. Doc and Flannelhead, or by their stage names Hocus and Pocus, were a pair of accident-prone magicians who, along with their rabbit Moyton, want to be detectives, but their ineptitude always lands them in trouble that Superman has to get them out of. Hocus and Pocus were an early attempt at adding comic relief characters to Superman comics, but they didn't last long, first appearing in Action Comics issue 83 in 1945, and only returning a few times more. They feel more like characters out of Mutt and Jeff than anything else. Oh dear, Matt and Jeff, I'm hammering out the obscure references. Kizo, Mala, and Yuban were a trio of Kryptonians known as the Evil Three. They were former members of the ruling council of Krypton, but after a failed attempt to conquer Krypton that was thwarted by Jor-El, they were put in suspended animation and exiled from the planet. Decades later, in 1950, they debuted in Superman issue 65, and they tried to conquer Earth and defeat Superman, the son of the one who prevented them from seizing power on Krypton. They only made one more appearance 4 years later in Action Comics issue 194. What's notable about them is that they were the first Kryptonian antagonist Superman faced, which predates the Phantom Zone criminals who would lock horns with Superman from the 1960s onwards. Lightning Master. See this? This is the iconic cover to Superman issue 14 from 1942. The comic features a story with Lightning Master, a supervillain who threatens Metropolis with a lightning machine and wants the city to pay him all the monies. He has no style. He has no grace. This lame gimp is called Funny Face. In Superman issue 19, this comic artist took his shot at stardom by drawing comic strips. When nobody bought his comics, he did the most sensible thing any struggling creative soul would do. He created a reality bending machine that made his comic characters real, and instead of patenting it and becoming the richest and most celebrated scientist in the world, he makes his comic characters go out to destroy things and steal money for him. The machine can also turn people into cartoons, which he does to Lois. This imbecile could have become the richest man in the world through perfectly legal means, but used his machine in the dullest way possible, leading him to get unmasked by Superman Scooby-Doo style. Is it possible to be a genius and a mouth breather at the same time? Mr. Blob, the tycoon of crime. In Superman issue 29, this self-proclaimed tycoon of crime already made his fortune legitimately, but retired so he can make more money through illegal means, for fun I guess. He operated everything from his chair with buttons on it.
Now then, what are you doing in Jimmy's magic chair?
Whether Blob is his real legal name or he calls himself that out of self-deprecation, I don't know. What a schmuck. Steve Bard was a co-worker with Lois and Clark at the Daily Planet who liked to laugh at Lois when she got an assignment he thought would be insultingly trivial. He only had one appearance during the Golden Age in Superman issue 29, which was a good call because he would have crowded up the Daily Planet once Jimmy Olsen was in the picture. Swami Riva. Dan Rivers, calling himself Swami Riva, conned people into thinking he was a fortune teller and used concealed kryptonite to convince people he can use magic to weaken Superman, with the aim to build a reputation of someone who can actually do magic so he can extort money out of gangsters under the threat that he'll put a hex on them. Imagine going up to mob bosses and telling them if they don't give you money you'll put a spell on them. That could work on my superstitious grandmother who once gave a gypsy £5 under a threat of having a curse put on her, but somehow I don't think that would work on a shrewd and hardened crime boss. He only made one Golden Age appearance in 1949 in Superman issue 61, but he has the distinction of being the first character in the comics to use kryptonite against Superman. Alvin and Ronald Lang. When growing up in Smallville, Lionel Lang had two brothers, Alvin, who was in Superboy issue 26 and issue 48, and Ronald, who only existed in Adventure Comics 168 and was never seen again. Lana's parents were seen at various times, but her two brothers lost to time. Metallo of Krypton. Close to the end of the Golden Age in Superboy issue 49, Superboy encountered a robot that had been sent from Krypton years before it was destroyed. This Metallo has no relation to any other Metallo, and sacrifices itself to save Superboy from a cloud of kryptonite dust. The writers kept naming different characters Metallo, but this is the most obscure one. The Thing from 40,000 AD. The Thing was a shape-shifting alien blob from the future who was cast 38,000 years into the past, but focused on building a time machine to return back to conquer the world in its own time. During its time on Earth, it assumed the identity of Superman and gained his powers in the process, leading to a struggle between the two. Since this was published in 1954 in Superman issue 87, I can't help but think that this was inspired by The Thing from Another World, which came out 3 years earlier. Granted, The Thing doesn't really shapeshift in that film, but it does in the story it was based on. Who goes there? Now I might as well take the opportunity to tell you about these comics based on The Thing that Dark Horse published, because they're stellar. Supermanium. When a new element was found in World's Finest Comics issue 41, it was named after Superman as a tribute to him, since it was the strongest metal known to man. It was brought back on rare occasions after the Golden Age, like when Superman created Supermanium wires to control mythical monster statues as puppets to turn the tables on a practical Joker, and Supermanium was used to build a prison that could hold Brainiac. You have been watching the Golden Age Superman Iceberg. I hope you appreciate that I read hundreds of comics and sat through over 100 episodes of that 50s TV series to make this. If you've ever wanted a run through of Superman's history during this period, now I've made one for you. Have fun convincing everyone that you're an oracle of old-timey Superman knowledge when all you've done is watch a video on YouTube about it. You've been saved all the time it would take to read and watch all of that thanks to this video. Or should I say, thanks to Scoundrelish.